At 9:45 in the morning, on the 7th of December, 1941, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida banked his aircraft over Pearl Harbor and watched the smoke rising from Battleship Row. Two waves, 183 aircraft on the first strike, 167 on the second. The Arizona was gone. The Oklahoma had capsized. The West Virginia was on the bottom of the harbor. The California was sinking. By any military measure in history, what Japan had just executed was flawless. Fuchida radioed back to the fleet flagship, Akagi, Tora, Tora, Tora. Complete surprise achieved. Back aboard the carrier, Admiral Nagumo received the signal. His strike commanders were already pushing for a third wave. They had found the fuel depots, the dry docks, the submarine pens, the repair infrastructure, all of it untouched, all of it still standing. Nagumo ordered the fleet to withdraw. If you were alive on the 8th of December 1941, you believed America had just been crippled. What almost nobody understood then is that Japan had just made the single biggest strategic blunder of the entire war. Not Germany, not Italy, Japan at the moment of its greatest triumph. What they left standing at Pearl Harbor didn't just allow America to recover, it made Japan's defeat mathematically inevitable. In the next 16 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Nagumo refused to destroy, why he refused, and how that single afternoon decision determined who won World War II in the Pacific before a single island had been invaded. If you want to understand why every major turning point in history had a single decision that made it inevitable, subscribe. I break one down every week. Hit subscribe now before we go deep on this. Japan went to war for one reason: oil. By 1941, the United States had cut off 80% of Japan's petroleum supply through an embargo. Japan's military machine, its navy, its aircraft, its entire Pacific campaign ran on imported fuel. Without oil, Japan had roughly 18 months before its war machine stopped moving. The strategic logic of Pearl Harbor was simple: destroy the American Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with Japan's seizure of the Dutch East Indies oil fields, neutralize the threat, secure the fuel. Buy the time needed to build an impenetrable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. On paper, the plan made sense. Japan had the finest carrier strike force in the world. American forces at Pearl Harbor were unprepared. Intelligence failures were catastrophic, and the attack achieved complete tactical surprise. But there was a fault in the logic, one that Nagumo understood, and that his strike commanders kept trying to correct. Japan went to war specifically because it was running out of oil. That is not a strategic footnote. It was the entire reason 6 carriers crossed the Pacific. The goal was simple: destroy America's ability to fight, seize the Dutch East Indies, and secure the fuel Japan needed to survive. At Pearl Harbor, Japan's strike force found 4.5 million barrels of U.S. Navy fuel oil sitting in above-ground storage tanks on the southeastern shore of the harbor. Exposed, unprotected, fully visible from the air. Those tanks held enough fuel to sustain the entire American Pacific Fleet for 2 years of combat operations. They were not hardened. They were not buried. A single concentrated bomb run would have set them ablaze, and the fire could not have been controlled. Nagumo's strike commanders identified the tanks. They flagged them. They requested the third wave, specifically to destroy them. The order to withdraw came anyway. Here's what that number means in practice. The American ships that survived December 7th, the cruisers, the destroyers, the submarines, needed fuel to operate. Without those 4.5 million barrels, Pearl Harbor as a forward operating base becomes unusable. American forces have to fall back to the West Coast, San Diego, Puget Sound. Every operation in the Pacific now launches from California, not Hawaii. The distance is double, the response time doubles. The logistics chain stretches to its breaking point. Japan doesn't just damage the American Pacific Fleet. It removes Hawaii as a platform entirely. But that was only the first thing Nagumo refused to destroy. The battleships at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, the ships the world saw, the ships that filled every newspaper front page on December 8th, those were already becoming obsolete. The war in the Pacific was going to be decided by aircraft carriers, and every American carrier had been at sea that morning, entirely by accident. But the more important asset wasn't the carriers. It was the infrastructure underneath them. Pearl Harbor's dry docks were among the largest in the Pacific. They could repair a battleship. They could repair a carrier. They could turn a ship that had taken torpedo hits and bomb damage back into a combat-ready vessel in weeks, rather than the months it would take to tow it to the American mainland. Every ship the Japanese bombed that wasn't sunk could be repaired right there, in Pearl Harbor, using the dry docks that survived December 7th completely untouched. The USS Nevada was beached before she sank. The USS Pennsylvania sat in Dry Dock 1, damaged but not destroyed. Both were repaired and back in action within months. But here's what no one calculated on the Japanese side. 6 of the 8 battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor were eventually returned to combat service. Let that settle. Japan's greatest military strike destroyed exactly 2 American battleships permanently, the Arizona and the Oklahoma. Everything else came back. The dry docks made that possible. Commander Minoru Genda designed the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo executed it. And on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, there was a fundamental disagreement between what the operation required and what Nagumo was willing to risk. Nagumo was a surface warfare commander, battleships, cruisers, gunnery. He had been assigned command of the carrier strike force because of his rank, not because he believed in carrier aviation as a decisive instrument of war. His strike commanders Genda, Fuchida, and others understood what carriers could accomplish. They had planned a 3-wave operation specifically because 2 waves were not sufficient to destroy everything that needed destroying. Nagumo canceled the 3rd wave because he feared American counterattack. He didn't know where the American carriers were. His fleet had been at sea for 11 days. He was deep in enemy waters with no air cover once his aircraft were committed to a 3rd strike. His caution was logical from a surface warfare perspective. It was catastrophic from a strategic one. The 3rd asset Nagumo left intact was the submarine base. American submarines would sink more Japanese merchant tonnage during the Pacific War than all other weapons combined. They strangled Japan's supply lines. They cut off the Dutch East Indies oil fields that Japan had gone to war to capture. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese tankers faster than Japan could build them, and the oil that had been the entire purpose of the war was sitting at the bottom of the Pacific rather than reaching Japanese refineries. Pearl Harbor's submarine pens survived December 7th without a single hit. The submarines based out of Pearl Harbor went on to sink over 1,300 Japanese vessels, including 214 warships. The fuel depots powered the fleet that hunted Japan across the Pacific. The dry docks repaired the ships Japan thought it had destroyed. The submarine base launched the campaign that strangled Japan's economy. All three untouched. All three functional within 72 hours of the attack. Here's the chess position Japan created for itself. Japan needed time. The entire Pacific strategy depended on establishing a defensive perimeter, a ring of island fortresses from the Aleutians to Rabaul to the Dutch East Indies before America could marshal its industrial capacity and respond. Japan's military planners estimated they had perhaps 18 months to 2 years before American production outpaced anything Japan could field. That estimate assumed Pearl Harbor accomplished its mission. Pearl Harbor's mission was not to sink battleships. Battleships were already being replaced by carriers as the decisive weapon of naval warfare. Japanese naval planners knew this. It was why they built the Kido Butai carrier strike force in the first place. The mission was to buy time by crippling America's ability to project power into the Pacific. With the fuel depots intact, the American fleet was operational within weeks. With the dry docks intact, the damaged ships were repaired within months. With the submarine base intact, the campaign to interdict Japanese supply lines began within days. Instead of 18 months of breathing room, Japan had roughly 6 months before the American counteroffensive found its footing. Midway happened in June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan lost 4 carriers in 3 days, including Nagumo's flagship. The timetable that made Japan's Pacific strategy viable collapsed entirely, and it collapsed because of what was left standing on the 7th of December, 1941. But there's a deeper question, one that cuts to the root of the blunder. Japan went to war for oil. This is the fact that frames everything. The Dutch East Indies, the oil fields Japan invaded in December 1941 and January 1942, had to be connected to the Japanese home islands by sea, tankers, merchant shipping. A maritime supply line running thousands of miles through submarine-patrolled waters. Destroying Pearl Harbor's submarine base was therefore not secondary to the mission. It was arguably the most important single target at Pearl Harbor. Every barrel of oil captured from the Dutch East Indies had to pass within range of American submarines to reach Japan. The submarines based at Pearl Harbor were the instrument that would eventually render Japan's entire strategic rationale, the oil, unreachable. Japan conquered the oil, then left intact the weapon that would prevent the oil from ever arriving. Fuchida understood this. After the war, he spent years writing and lecturing about the failure of December 7th, not the attack itself, but what the attack left undone. He landed back aboard Akagi that afternoon, convinced that Japan had won a battle and lost the war in the same 6 hours. He was right. The fuel depots intact meant American operations continued without interruption. The dry docks intact meant the damaged fleet returned to combat strength. The submarine base intact meant Japan's supply lines were under threat from day one. But Nagumo's calculation, the one that drove the withdrawal order, reveals something even more important than the tactical mistake. When the second wave of aircraft returned to the Kido Butai on the afternoon of December 7th, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was among the last to land. He had circled the harbor, observing the damage, counting what burned and what didn't. He walked into the briefing room knowing the fuel depots were intact. knowing the dry docks were intact, knowing the submarine base hadn't been touched. He argued for the third wave directly. Genda argued alongside him. The strike had cost Japan 29 aircraft. The Americans were in chaos. The base was unprepared. Defenses were disorganized. A third wave would have faced far less opposition than the first. Nagumo refused. The official reason was uncertainty about the location of the American carriers and concern about fuel for the return voyage. These were legitimate tactical concerns. But Fuchida's assessment, written decades later, after years of reflection, was that Nagumo had accomplished what he personally believed was possible, declared victory, and stopped. He had not understood what the mission actually required. The battle was a tactical masterpiece. The decision to end it was a strategic catastrophe, and the man who made that decision shaped the rest of the war more profoundly than any of the battles that followed. There is a version of the 7th of December 1941 that plays out differently. In that version, Nagumo launches the third wave. The fuel depots burn for 3 weeks. A fire of that scale and that fuel load cannot be controlled. The dry docks are cratered. The submarine pens are destroyed. American operations in the Pacific are set back, not by weeks, but by 18 months to 2 years. Japan's defensive perimeter has time to consolidate. Midway might not happen. In June 1942, American carriers are stretched thin, operating from the mainland, unable to project power deep into the Central Pacific on shortened timelines. The island-hopping campaign begins later. The logistics chain is longer. Every engagement is harder. This is not speculation about Japan winning the war. American industrial production, 96,000 aircraft in 1944. 8 aircraft carriers commissioned in 1944 alone meant Japan was eventually going to lose. The question was always how long and at what cost. What the fuel depots, the dry docks, and the submarine base represent is the difference between a war that grinds on for 5 or 6 years versus the war that actually happened. The difference between an American campaign that takes a decade to reach Japan versus the one that put B-29S over Tokyo by 1945. Nagumo's withdrawal didn't just cost Japan a tactical opportunity. It compressed the timeline of its own defeat. By the summer of 1942, the shape of the Pacific War was fixed. Midway, in June, destroyed Japan's offensive carrier capability in a single afternoon. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had already demonstrated that carrier aviation, not battleships, determined naval outcomes. American shipyards running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, were commissioning new vessels faster than Japan could sink them. But the precondition for all of this was Pearl Harbor's survival as a functioning base. Without the fuel depots, the carriers that won Midway don't have the operational range to reach the engagement. Without the dry docks, the ships damaged at Coral Sea aren't repaired in time to fight at Midway. Without the submarine base, the interdiction campaign that ultimately strangles Japan doesn't begin until years later. The chess position Japan created at Pearl Harbor was one of the most expensive in military history. They executed a brilliant combination, captured material, and left their own position fundamentally compromised. They sacrificed tempo for a tactical win. And in a strategic endgame, tempo is everything. Japan entered the war knowing it could not match American industrial production indefinitely. The entire strategy depended on speed, hit hard, fortify fast, make the cost of American counterattack too high to bear. Pearl Harbor was supposed to buy that time. It didn't, because of what three sets of targets that survived December 7th represented: the capacity to recover, the capacity to repair, and the capacity to strangle. The deepest irony is this: Japan fought a war to secure oil. The Dutch East Indies campaign succeeded. Japan captured the oil fields largely intact. But by 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese tankers so efficiently that the captured oil couldn't reach Japan in meaningful quantities. The ships that transported that oil had to pass through submarine patrol zones operating out of Pearl Harbor. Japan won the oil and couldn't use it. The fuel that powered the American counteroffensive came from the 4.5 million barrels Nagumo left standing at Pearl Harbor. The submarines that cut off Japan's captured oil operated from the submarine base Nagumo left standing at Pearl Harbor. The carriers that won Midway were repaired and serviced at the dry docks Nagumo left standing at Pearl Harbor. The war Japan fought for oil was ultimately decided by what happened to oil and oil infrastructure in 6 hours on the 7th of December 1941. Japan captured the oil fields. America kept the fuel depot. America won. Every military history of Pearl Harbor is written as a story of American resilience. The sleeping giant awakened. The industrial power mobilized. The inevitable triumph of democratic will. That framing is not wrong, but it obscures the more precise truth. America didn't recover from Pearl Harbor despite the attack. America recovered because of what the attack left standing. The decision that determined the outcome of the Pacific War wasn't made in Washington on December 8th. It wasn't made at Midway in June 1942. It was made aboard the carrier Akagi on the afternoon of the 7th of December 1941, when Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered his fleet to withdraw with the fuel depots still full, the dry docks still operational, and the submarine pens still intact. Japan's greatest tactical victory was the move that locked in its own defeat. The most dangerous position in chess isn't the one where you're losing material. It's the one where you've won material and left your opponent's infrastructure intact to rebuild around you. Japan never understood that Pearl Harbor wasn't the attack. Pearl Harbor was what the attack failed to finish. If you want to go deeper, the next breakdown is right there. And if you found this useful, subscribe before you leave. One video every week. See you on the next move.